Would you care for some of the vegetables?
Yes, please.
Very good, ma'am.
There are marriages that end loudly, with arguments that exhaust entire households and leave marks on walls. And then there are marriages that end in particular silence of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do, who is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. This is the story of Celeste Monroe and the family that spent 5 years underestimating her. The dinner was held at the Harmon family estate in Brentwood, Tennessee, on a Thursday evening in September, a weekly tradition that Elliott Harmon had maintained faithfully since before he met Celeste, and that Celeste had attended faithfully since they married, adapting herself to the rhythms of a household that had never quite adapted itself to her in return. Frances Harmon sat at the far end of the table, in the chair that had been hers for 30 years, and waited until the first course had been clear before she said what she had been building toward for most of the evening. She said, "We think it is time to be honest about the fact that this marriage was always temporary." She said it the way she said most difficult things, with the particular calm of a woman who had decided, well in advance, that she was not going to be the one made uncomfortable by them. Celeste set her fork down. She folded her napkin with the careful precision she brought to every small act that required her hands to remain steady. She pushed her chair back from the table. She looked at Elliott, who was sitting at the head of the table, reaching for the wine bottle. He poured himself a second glass. She excused herself from the table. She collected her bag from the hook near the front door, where she had placed it when they arrived. She walked to the car. She did not return to that table. Celeste Monroe had grown up in Nashville, the granddaughter of a woman named Ada, who had spent 40 years running a catering operation out of a church kitchen in North Nashville, and who believed, with the particular certainty of someone who has never had reason to doubt it, that feeding people was the most direct form of love available to a person. Ada had taught Celeste to cook from the time she could reach the stove. She had also taught Celeste to run the numbers on everything, costs, margins, seasonal adjustments, because love without structure, Ada used to say, was just a feeling waiting to run out of money. Celeste had taken both lessons seriously. She had studied finance at Fisk University, worked for 5 years at a private equity firm in Atlanta, and at 29 had launched her own fund, Monroe Capital Partners, with a combination of her savings, a loan from 3 former colleagues who believed in her analysis, and a kind of focused, unhurried work ethic that Ada had modeled every single morning of Celeste's childhood. By the time she met Elliott Harmon at a Nashville investment conference 3 years later, Monroe Capital Partners had been operating quietly and profitably for 36 months. She had not mentioned it at dinner parties. She had not brought up on their first date, or their second, or their third. She was not in the habit of explaining herself to people before they had given her a reason to trust them with the explanation. She had fallen in love with Elliott gradually and genuinely. He was smart, attentive, easy to be with in the specific way of a man who had grown up knowing how to make people comfortable in a room. She had believed for a while that he extended this quality to her in a permanent way. She had not yet fully understood the distinction between a man being kind to you and a man choosing you when choosing you costs something. Frances Harmon had made her opinion of Celeste clear within the first 6 months of the relationship, through a series of comments so precisely calibrated to deniability that arguing against them would have required Celeste to spend more energy than she was willing to give. Frances spoke warmly about the families of Elliott's previous relationships. She asked Celeste questions that were slightly more specific than they needed to be about her background. She made observations about the wedding, when it happened, that were framed as preferences but functioned as corrections. Celeste had observed all of it. She had filed away in the same methodical way she filed everything. And she had made, in the 2 years before the dinner in Brentwood, a series of very careful decisions about the structure of her life and her finances that she had not discussed with anyone in the Harmon family, because she had learned by then that the Harmon family had never been genuinely interested in anything about her that they did not believe served their own purposes. 3 months before the dinner in Brentwood, Celeste had met with her attorneys and her fund's managing partners and had quietly restructured every holding of Monroe Capital Partners to ensure that nothing in the fund's portfolio could be characterized as marital property in any forthcoming legal proceeding. The restructuring had taken 6 weeks and had been executed with a kind of thoroughness that left no ambiguity, no contested middle ground, no room for a family attorney to argue about the edges. It had been completed 16 days before Frances made her announcement at the table. The divorce papers arrived at Celeste's office on a Monday morning 3 weeks after the dinner. She read them at her desk, the way she read every document that required her full attention, from beginning to end, without skipping, noting every detail. She set them on the left side of her desk when she was done, the way she set aside things she had already decided about and did not need to revisit. That Friday evening, she went home and cooked dinner. She made her grandmother Ada's chicken with braised collard greens and the cornbread that required 2 separate mixing bowls and a cast iron skillet that had been in Ada's kitchen since 1974. She made enough for 4 people, which was more than she needed for one. She set the table where Ada had always set it, cloth napkins folded into precise rectangles. The good plates on a weeknight, because Ada had taught her that the good plates were for living in, not for saving. She sat alone at the table. She ate every bite. She thought about Ada. She did not cry. Then she washed the dishes, dried them, and put them away. The following Monday morning, her attorney filed a formal notice of withdrawal of Monroe Capital Partners from his position as a silent equity holder in Harmon Capital Ventures, the flagship investment vehicle of the Harmon family's financial operation. Douglas Reed had been the Harmon family's financial advisor for 31 years. He had joined the firm as a junior analyst when Elliott's father was still running the operation, and he had stayed through 3 generations of Harmon wealth management with a particular loyalty of a man who understood that his value was in knowing more about a family's financial architecture than they themselves remembered. He was thorough, discreet, and had a professional habit of reviewing every instrument in the family's portfolio on the first Monday of each month. On the first Monday of October, Douglas sat at his desk and opened the Harmon Capital Ventures file the way he always did. He found the withdrawal notice file that morning. He found the silent equity instrument behind it, a 29% stake in Harmon Capital Ventures, held since the fund's founding year by Monroe Capital Partners, predating by 2 years of marriage between Celeste Monroe and Elliott Harmon. He read the instrument twice. He read the withdrawal notice once. He sat back in his chair. He had worked for this family for 31 years. He knew every significant instrument in their portfolio. He had apparently not known this one as well as he believed he had, because the fund's complexity had grown in recent years, and the original silent equity instrument was embedded in a layer of documentation he had reviewed only at its surface. He was looking at it clearly now, and what it said clearly was that 29% of everything the Harmon family called their flagship investment had belonged, from the beginning, to a fund that Celeste Monroe had built before she ever sat at one of their Thursday dinners. The debt covenants on Harmon Capital Ventures required a minimum of 60% of equity holders to maintain their positions for any rolling 12-month period. A 29% withdrawal triggered an immediate lender review. Douglas picked up the phone. He called Elliott. Elliott answered in the easy voice of a man who had spent the past 2 weeks telling himself that the divorce had been resolved and the discomfort of it was behind him. Douglas said, "Do you know who owns 29% of the Harmon vehicle?" Elliott said, "The founding partners." Douglas said, "One of them is your ex-wife, and she filed notice of withdrawal this morning." The silence on the line lasted several seconds. Then Elliott said, "What does that mean for fun?" Douglas said, in the measured voice he used for delivering information that he understood would take some time to fully absorb, "It means the lenders have been automatically notified, and we are now in a review period during which we will need to demonstrate covenant compliance or present a recapitalization plan. I would suggest we speak in person as soon as possible." He had worked for this family for 31 years. He had never made a call quite like this one. The lender review was triggered within 48 hours of the withdrawal notice. The family's attorneys were brought in immediately. The fund's documentation was reviewed in its entirety for the first time in several years. And what that review confirmed was consistent with what Douglas had found, that the Harmon family's flagship investment vehicle had been underpinned from its earliest and most vulnerable years by capital and credibility that had belonged to Celeste Monroe's fund. Francis called Celeste on a Wednesday afternoon. The call was not returned. Elliott called 9 times over the following 2 weeks. Celeste's phone registered each call, and she watched them arrive the way you watch weather through a window when you're already inside and have already decided not to go out. On the 14th call, she picked up. She listened to him for 45 seconds. Then she said, "Elliott, you made a decision. I made mine. Good luck with the review." She ended the call. She did not call back. 6 weeks after the withdrawal notice, a colleague from Celeste's earlier years in Atlanta reached out to congratulate her on the news that Monroe Capital Partners had been named to a regional list of the most significant emerging private equity operations in the Southeast. They spoke for a while, catching up on the years between them. The colleague asked, eventually, how she had navigated the personal disruption of the divorce while continuing to build. Celeste thought about it for a moment. She said, "I cooked dinner every Friday because my grandmother taught me that feeding people was how you love them. I kept cooking after he left because I had not stopped loving myself. The fun was the same idea. I had been building it since before any of this started. I just kept going. That is the only strategy one have ever had." She paused. She said, "It turns out it was enough." That evening, Douglas Reed sat alone in his office on the 14th floor of the building where he had worked for 31 years. The Harmon files were stacked around him, volumes of them, decades of transactions and instruments and reviews, the accumulated financial architecture of a family that had believed, without examining that belief very carefully, that they had built everything themselves. He looked at the original silent equity instrument. He looked at the founding date of Monroe Capital Partners. He looked at the date of the marriage certificate that sat in the family file beside it. He picked up his pen. He wrote 4 words on the margin of his notepad. Slowly, the way you write something you want to get exactly right. She funded everything. He set the pen down. He closed the file. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who is building quietly and needs to know that the foundation matters more than the noise above it. And tell me in the comments, who do you think lost more, Elliott for signing the papers or Francis for being the reason he did? I will see you in the next story.